Hello, everyone. Good evening. My name is Shir Hever. I am the manager of BIP, the Alliance for Justice between Palestinians and Israelis, or Bündnis für Gerechtigkeit zwischen Israelis und Palästinenser. Usually we have our events in German, but today we have it in English because of our very special and honored guest, Francesca Albanese, who is the special rapporteur on Palestine for the United Nations. She's also an affiliate scholar at the Institute for the Study of International Migration at Georgetown University, and a senior advisor for the Arab Renaissance for Democracy and Development, a co-founder of the Global Network on the Question of Palestine. Her most recent book is Palestinian Refugees in International Law from 2020. So she's very active, has a lot to tell us today. I don't want to take any more of her time, so we can get started. Thank you, Francesca.
Thank you very much, Shiver, and I would like to thank all of you who are here, and also my colleague Sarah, just so that you know that the probably unfamiliar faces are the special rapporteur and her closest collaborator. So I'm glad to be with you today, as Shir and I have been meeting over the past months, and I will explain you why. But before I get there, I apologize for forcing you to have this discussion in English. I don't speak German. I cannot say unfortunately, but I just don't. And I would like to explain for those of you who are not familiar with UN special rapporteurs, what's my mandate, what I do, and then also, I'm happy to keep it interactive with Shir in the beginning, and so answer some of the main questions related to what I've done during the first year of my mandate, what are the key areas where I'm focusing my attention. But also I would like to have this as an opportunity to answer your questions, to hear your thoughts, and to see how, if and how, we can move along together as a part of a community of intent which shares same values and purposes, with the common denominator being humanity, respect for human rights and justice. This being said, so a UN Special Rapporteur of the United Nations is an expert who's mandated by the by the Human Rights Council of the United Nations, which is based in Geneva, to report on international law violations or violations of human rights law in particular, either on a given topic or on a given country. Most of the special rapporteurs, and we are about 50, are thematic. For example, prevention of torture, respecting human rights while countering terrorism, right to food, right to water, freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, and so on and so forth. There are, the number of those with a country-specific focus is very limited. We are about 12 or 14 now. My mandate covering the occupied Palestinian territory, meaning the territory that Israel has occupied since 1967. West Bank is Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, not the Golan Heights. So it's only the occupied Palestinian territory. And this mandate has been created 31 years ago. I'm the eighth person, the eighth mandate holder, the eighth special rapporteur, and the first woman on this job, which I'm very proud of. It's a voluntary job, so it's honorary. It's considered very important. So when we go around, we meet with ministers, vice ministers, but it's not paid in order to preserve our independence, which is why Most of us keep their, I mean, my current professional commitments are part-time with university, a part-time with the organization ARD, working on migration and refugees, but it's very tough because this mandate is very demanding. What is the mandate about? The mandate includes documenting and reporting on violations of international law that in fact, Israel's violations of international law in the occupied Palestinian territory. My point is that when the mandate was passed, Israel was the main duty bearer, was the sole authority in the occupied territory. The Palestinian Authority was not there. The de facto authority was not there. So for me, it's obvious that I look at all violations committed in the occupied Palestinian territory that have a relevance from an international law point of view. Because I take and I'm very strong on that, I take a very people-centered approach. So what is the situation that people in the occupied territory experience, and how can my reports, first and foremost, or my work be of assistance? So whom do I report to? I report to the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly of the United Nations on a country basis, on an yearly basis. And normally these reports should be written based on country visits. And this is the first problem, because since 2007, Israel, which has never recognized this mandate, but until 2007, it has not hampered Special Rapporteur's visits. Since 2007, when it arrested, in fact, the former Special Rapporteur, Professor Richard Falk, and detained him for almost 2 days at the Tel Aviv airport, then since then, no Special Rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territory has been allowed in, which is of course a violation of Israel's obligations as part of the international human rights system. However, we can agree that this is not the worst of the lack of compliance with international law that Israel is responsible of. However, the fact that I cannot access the occupied Palestinian territory is absolutely unacceptable, but to an extent not the worst I need to face, because I've lived there. I lived 3 years in Jerusalem, and then as I left Jerusalem, where I was working in the legal department of UNRWA, the UN agency devoted to Palestinian refugees. As I left UNRWA, then I moved to the academia, and I spent 5 years researching, and so always coming back to the region, including Jerusalem, basically the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And so I've seen over the span of a decade how a situation that was, for me, was very painful, continued to deteriorate. So lacking the possibility so far of visiting the occupied Palestinian territory, I have invested a lot in establishing good relations and productive relations with a range of communities. I was already well known, and I had already good contacts with Palestinian human rights organizations. Zero contacts with other than a few Israeli friends, but zero contacts with Israeli organizations or communities. So as I was invested of this role, I made a huge commitment and a huge effort to be also to change this pattern of this special rapporteur, this mandate being seen as the special rapporteurs of the Palestinians. I'm not an advocate, so I'm an advocate on human rights issues, yes, but I'm not the advocate for anyone. So I've made, as I said, a significant effort in what I've also seen as a door-to-door policy in the beginning, contacting academics in Israel and fellow lawyers. And then this is where my community has started to expand. And then I realized that these contacts were precious, not only for an educational purpose, because I needed to understand better the Israeli society, but also how Israel is perceived among Jews. Because Shiver was saying something interesting in the beginning. Oh no, sorry, probably I'm confusing with another meeting I was having. I apologize. But it's often said Palestine is something everyone has an opinion about. It's not just Palestine, it's also Israel and also Israelis. And there are so many, I wouldn't necessarily say misconceptions, but there are a lot of assumptions that are made. And sometimes they are supported by facts, sometimes they're not. And I didn't want to walk on assumptions. So I've also started to engage with Jewish communities, of course, in the beginning in the US and in Canada, because they are well structured, well organized, very vocal. And this is when I realized, really coming to Germany, how difficult it is to be a progressive Jew in Europe, in a country like Germany. I would have never thought, but I was mentioning to those of you who were with me before the meeting, it was shocking for me to hear the struggle that German Jews, for example, or Jews in Germany face in their actions in solidarity with the question of Palestine, in solidarity with the Palestinian people, or just for being active, including as scholars, as journalists, as anyone else, on the side of human rights and justice in Israel and Palestine. I didn't expect that. It's been a moment of awakening. And again, over the year, I've established good contacts with a number of Jewish communities around Europe, but also with academics, with civil society networks. And what has happened is interesting, because while I cannot go to Palestine, I've had many visits to European countries. I've been to Norway, to the UK, to Ireland, and it's not just for conferences. I've met with governments, with civil society, with churches, trade unions, other religious groups, Palestinian solidarity groups, Jewish groups, sometimes solidarity, sometimes less. But again, so every visit becomes a moment of conscientization, in a way, a moment to raise awareness and build a discussion together. Because why, for example, I'm engaging with you today. And again, I think it's a moment of mutual learning. I think that we are part of a human rights community. We might have different ideas, we might have different opinions, but if our common denominator is human rights must be respected for all, and human rights should be equal and equally accessible to all, regardless of differences in racial groups or religion or gender, political credo, etc. So this is where I'm looking at every group as a way to say, how can we stop this madness? And I never use this word, but looking at what's happening today and what has been happening since, particularly, I mean, since I took this job in May 2022, it has been extremely violent. No month has passed without hundreds of Palestinians being arrested, dozens of Palestinians being killed, including children. Of course, there have been also deaths on the Israeli side, and this is all despicable, and this can and must be avoided. With my first report, and this is the second, but also the last issue I wanted to share with you. In my first report to the General Assembly, I have focused on the right of self-determination of the Palestinian people inside the occupied Palestinian territory. And I've been I've been significantly criticized, including, not significantly, but not, I mean, I've been criticized by some Israelis I've engaged with, because they said, well, but why did you feel compelled to talk about the right of the Palestinians in the occupied territory and not about us? And eventually, I mean, I was very candid. I said, it's not all about you. Excuse me. I mean, you have your right of self-determination because you do have, in the form of statehood, you have it. But also you have it because if the question is Jewish self-determination, and I do not believe such a thing is key, because self-determination goes with people and territory. But however, everyone has the right to be protected as a minority. So for those in Israel, it's their state. Israel protects everyone, should protect everyone equally, regardless of ethnicity, religion, and so on and so forth. And Jewish people outside of Israel, without Israeli citizenship, are they discriminated against? Are they treated as non-citizens because of being Jew? Because if this is the question, well, this is a problem. If it's not the case, as many, Lara Friedman, Alon Confino say, well, can we move on? Meaning, again, I know that this is a sensitive issue, but it's not affirming that the Palestinians have a right of self-determination doesn't mean to deny in any possible way the rights, either historical rights of the Jewish people to historical Palestine, or including to what is the occupied Palestinian territory. But it's not a call for annihilation. It's not a call for ethnic cleansing, as Benjamin Netanyahu said recently. No, of course it's not. Human rights is a way to respect, I mean, to find a solution which is respectful for everyone. And this is why I said, Otto, I will reply to you in a minute. But thank you for your question. So I said the occupation in and of itself after 56 years is absolutely incompatible with international law, operates outside what is permitted by international law. And not only because of what, for example, there are brilliant Israeli scholars like Orna Ben Naftali, Ayel Gross, or Michael Sfard, who have written wonderful books about how Israel violates each article of the Fourth Geneva Conventions and Hague Regulations. It's not just that, it's that an occupation which has been maintained for 56 years and has prevented the exercise of basic rights. It has translated into a vehicle to seize and annex, confiscate and annex land and resources, displacing the local population and replacing it with its own civilians. These are two different war crimes under international law, and all of them, I mean, the forcible transfer of civilians under occupation and the transfer and the settler implantation. It is this, and then we can discuss. But however, Israel has no right under international law to use the land in the occupied territory as it does. And it has also confused the mind of its own citizens by erasing the green line from the maps in Israeli textbooks. This is why in the beginning I couldn't understand, while also many Israelis would say, why do you talk about occupied territories? There are autonomous areas, there are disputed territories. No, dears, it's occupied territory under international law, and there are hundreds of resolutions of the UN. Either would believe in a organic international community, which universal rules for all, or we don't. But if we do, we abide by it. We cannot take international law as a menu à la carte. This turns rights into privileges, and this is not the international law I practice. And so this was my first report, which received, I was very surprised to see that it received a really huge coverage, because frankly, the topic of self-determination can be seen as an abstraction, as something theoretical for many. But it has been very well received, and I look forward to the publication of my second report, which is about to come out this week or the next one, and it's about deprivation of liberty. I focused on arbitrary deprivation of liberty because it's massive, because Israel for 56 years has arrested for at least once about 1 million Palestinians, tens of thousands of children. And very often, despite the draconian legal system, which I've analyzed, I've explained what are the main charges that lead to arrest and detention of Palestinians, and without denying the Palestinians commit crimes, they even commit acts of terror against Israel and Israeli civilians. This is out of question, but analyzing the violations committed by the Palestinians is a very wrong starting point. The starting point is the occupation that Israel has maintained for 56 years, which has translated into land confiscation, arbitrary arrest and detention, forcible displacement, endless humiliation and indignities, and which through arrest and detention on grounds that, if you read, I'm happy also to share with you during the discussion, if you read the reasons why Palestinians get arrested to 10 years, 20 years, life imprisonment, you get shocked. You have really, it gives you goosebumps, because this is just the exercise, it's not criminal activities, it's the exercise of normal freedoms. And this is the point. Israel punishes through its military orders Palestinians when they oppose the occupation. So yes, there might be acts that amount to criminal acts, but not the majority of the Palestinians are not arrested because they are criminal under international law. So, and I've also then connected the study of the legal grounds. Really, I've unpacked with my research team over thousands of military orders that also contradict each other strongly. And I was advised by Israeli lawyers who work in courts and Palestinian lawyers who do the same on how to read them. It was a huge undertaking. And then I've looked at custodial conditions. What happens when Palestinians are arrested, transferred, interrogated, and detained? And the violations throughout this detention cycle are really sickening. I had researchers going on vicarious trauma because of the documentation they had to deal with. And I've also studied the case of families who have their children taken since the age of 12, and families the body of whose beloved ones is never returned. There are hundreds of about 270 bodies who are not returned, body of Palestinians detained who are not returned to their families. All this is against international law. Of course, I added the detailed description of the violations of international law this entails, but I've also analyzed this in the context of the wider carcerality that Israel exercises in the occupied Palestinian territory. For example, think of the physical barriers, like the wall, the settlements created around, like a ring around every village and every city, and things of the segregated roads, which are not just 400 kilometers of roads in the OPT, in the West Bank, that then Palestinians cannot access. These are also arteries that cut the territory and the Palestinians cannot cross. It's also incredibly difficult for farmers and for pastoralist communities to live in that territory. And then, of course, there is the wall and the blockade of Gaza, but on top of the physical, and of course, all entry points and exits manned by Israel. And so the Palestinians are not free to go in and out wherever whenever and wherever they like. Most importantly, these are the physical barriers that some would capture, but there are invisible barriers. And this is what is the system of permits and bans. The Palestinians have to apply for hundreds of permits. And this is documented by Breaking the Silence. To build a house, to take residence, to visit their family, to enter one area, to cross certain areas, because 60% of the territory of the West Bank, for example, is controlled by Israel. Palestinians do not move and live freely, to go to university, to study abroad, to access medical services. Everything is dictated by Israel. Yes, the Palestinian authorities exist, and to an extent, even at the layer of repression to the Palestinians, because of the security arrangements that they have with Israel. They're surely not there to protect the Palestinians, as you can see in Termsieh or Hawara or South Hebron Hills or Masafer Yatta. Who's protecting the Palestinians from the settlers and the army? No one. And this is what I would like you to focus on. I'm not justifying, and I will never justify crimes, especially crimes, violations of international law. But at the same time, the Palestinians are like any people. They will react, they will always react against their jailer, because Israel has built a jail through the occupation. And it's a jail that is constantly surveilled. And think of the CCTV, thousands of CCTV cameras and digital surveillance on phones, on social media, biometric capturing of data. This is not life. This is life in prison. And this is why I eventually concluded that Israel, through its occupation, has established a panopticon in the occupied Palestinian territory. Is it a good ground for security? This is the question. Voila.
Thank you very much, Francesca. You've given us a lot to think about, and I already have a list of my own questions, but I think it's more fair to let the audience ask, and you've also already seen the question about apartheid, so go ahead.
Yes, there is the question from Otto. Do you mind, can you tell me where I can find it? Because I think he asked me if I believe that Israel is an apartheid society.
Yeah.
I do not think that this language is correct. I don't think that there is such a thing like an apartheid society. There are two concepts, and one is more legal than the other. In international law, there is the crime of apartheid that occurs when there is a system of when there are systemic and widespread violations committed by one group over another with the intent to dominate. Yes, I do believe that the evidence that has been collected by Israelis, Palestinians, and international organizations, and my own predecessors, Michael Link, Richard Falk, John Duggar, they've all denounced it, and it amounts, Israel is committing the crime of apartheid. I also believe that Israel has maintained a regime of apartheid, meaning a dual regime, a regime of segregation and discrimination, surely in the occupied territory. I do not cover Israel, so I cannot answer questions concerning Israel. What happens to the Palestinians with Israeli citizenship? But yes, I think that the evidence is overwhelming, and it has never been as documented in no case. I mean, I come from a conference last week. I was in a conference on apartheid South Africa, and South Africans themselves were saying, those of them who have visited the occupied Palestinian territory say it's much worse than what we have endured. If they say so, and they've written so, and there is literature about that, who am I to challenge? But again, I base myself on what Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and others have said, have denounced. That evidence is very compelling. And the sign of how compelling it is that I've not seen one, and I challenge everyone really, I encourage you to challenge me on this. I've not seen a single criticism of those reports on the substance. Anyone saying, no, but it's not true that the military courts do not work in this way. No, but it's not true that Israel segregates communities. They are always challenged on the ground that they are anti-Semitic because they criticize Israel. This is the way the apartheid reports have been dismissed. Now, Otto, going back to your question, is Israel an apartheid society? I will not be true to my mandate, and I will not be true to the way I'm interacting and knowing the Israeli society. I think that the Israeli society is behaving in a racist way, not different from my fellow Europeans. I'm sorry, but this is the truth, because they really don't see. The moment you cannot see the other as equal, as entitled to the same rights, and as a victim, because there is no question that between the Jordan River and the sea is the Palestinians who have less rights. It's obvious. It's even in the Israeli legal system. It is in the legal dualism there. So yes, it's racist. And as racist as European societies who really differentiate between human ethnicity. I find it pathetic in 2023, on top of it being illegal and immoral. And it is it.
Thank you. I don't see any more questions in the chat. So if other people have questions, then feel free to write them. We don't have time for a lot of questions. So if you're fast, you'll get your questions in. But I will use this opportunity, this little pause, to ask my own question, if that's okay. Francesca, I wanted to, because you just mentioned in your response about apartheid that Israeli society is no more racist or no less racist than European society. And this reminds me that when we had Michael Link here in this context to speak to us about his mandate and about his work as the special rapporteur, we had fewer people coming. Of course, the number of participants is also limited by the fact that it's in English. But I think for you, I see more people who made the effort to come and listen to you, maybe because you're also European, and because you can say something about the role of the European Union and not just the EU. And if you can say something about this racism that you mentioned, I think it would be very useful for us.
It's very interesting. Because again, one issue that I should also add is that let me correct also. Let me formulate, because most of the Israelis I know are not racist. I mean, most of the Israelis I engage with are not. They have been able to see what I see, and now that they see that, they cannot unsee it anymore. And I do not know any Israeli who has had this moment of awakening, has gone through this awakening and is not tormented, because it's heavy. And I get it. It's heavy because there is something I say, and I say that as a European, and this leads me then to the next question you raised. I often say we should never forget what the Jewish people as a whole have endured, but not just with the horror of the Holocaust. That was the culmination of it, but there were centuries of discrimination and persecution. And it's interesting because I was reminded that also as a young law student many years ago, I learned that there was a distinction on jobs that the Jewish people could access or not, based on the fact that they were Jews already at the time of the Romans. So there is something completely wrong and completely in history. And so it's a fact. So I think I can understand that their sense of persecution is so ingrained in any one part of the community of Jewish societies that who are we to judge? Meaning we non-Jewish. So this is not the issue. So I think I really remind myself of the place I need to come from, and it's a place of compassion. I'm not here to judge. I'm here to try to explain what international law has to say about that. So the reason why I believe that there is this racist attitude toward the Palestinians is because also there is a lot of manipulation of the information. There is this fantastic Israeli scholar, Nurit Peled, who has written a book which is very revealing, Palestinians in Israeli textbooks. And she and others raise awareness on the fact that there is a demonization and a sort of fostering fear in the Jewish Israeli societies toward the other, which is Palestinian, Arabs, etc. And so this is a huge difference between the Israelis, Jewish Israelis, and Europeans. We don't have that trauma. And I believed until a few years ago that the incapacity of European countries to bring Israel back on a path of compliance with international law was because of what I've called, and others have called, the sense of guilt toward the Jewish people for the Holocaust. I changed completely my mind. It has nothing to do with that. Because if all Europeans had learned a lesson, had really learned a lesson of what the Shoah has been, and I speak as an Italian, I think we wouldn't be doing what we do. We wouldn't have instances of anti-Semitism. It's shocking. I didn't know how present anti-Semitism is still in our societies. I didn't know. And I'm shocked to hear the anti-Jewish tropes that still circulate, and because there is something extremely sickening in the fact that in 2023, this is still part of our societies. And at the same time, I denounce anti-Semitism. In the same breath, I denounce Islamophobia and xenophobia and bigotry. We should be beyond this in 2023, but we are not, because, and this is something I'm very, unfortunately, I mean, I'm very sad, but also very conscious about. There is an enduring colonial legacy. There is an enduring colonial legacy in foreign relations. It's clear in the way Western countries, including the European Union, interact with the global South, individuals and people. And until we process that legacy and we undo it, until we as human rights community, I also tell to my fellow special rapporteurs and to the United Nations who struggles to advance, for example, in certain countries in Africa or in Asia, the universality of human rights. Of course, there is a reaction to this. Of course, they don't, and not everyone sees this as universal human rights, because we are unable to apply human rights without double standards, without making exceptions according to a selectivity that we European countries or we Western countries have set. So when I encounter European leaders or European politicians, or it very much depends. There are wonderful people who stand against a selective use of international law, who stand for justice and human rights. There are other people who are just, they don't want to take risks. And so they will not stand against anything, including by resenting morally and what they do. They will not take a stand. When I meet with, frankly, I've not had many opportunities of encounter with German officials, but those occasions I've had, those few occasions, were candid. I think that they know the reality on the ground, and they simply refuse to take a stand because they cannot still process what has happened. And why, as Ilan Pape says, not taking a clear stand on Israel and Palestine and not siding on justice and human rights, it's getting it wrong twice, and I quote Ilan Pape. Would you help me share with the other questions, which I do not see?
Yeah, of course. So we have 4 questions, and I think if you take not more than 3 minutes to answer each one, then at least everyone will get their answer.
Sorry, I'm a chatterbox.
Well, but you're saying very important things, but I think there are some overlaps between the questions. So some of what you said is already relevant.
Yeah.
The first question is from Eckhard Drost. Are you in contact with the German government? And if so, do the officials react when you talk to them like you talk to us? For example, the right of Palestinians to use violence. Do you want to gather these questions?
Can I
Okay,
have all
then,
the questions so I avoid the overlapping?
Okay, the next one is from Gunther Schenk, Signora Albanese, concerning international law. Which right has the subject of human rights offenses to oppose? Will the human rights law be able, as any human or would you be able, as any human would do, respond violently to being attacked? Or in human rights, will he be obliged to abide and just suffer? Is best case called for help by an institution or person like you? As Gideon Levy just tells us in the article today, whatever will be the response of the offended will make them a terrorist, which in consequence will give the wrongdoer all the rights upon the victim.
So basically, sorry, just for me to understand, Günther's question is, what are the instruments to respond to the current situation, both from a Palestinian?
Yes, what are the rights according to international law to resist?
Okay.
Yeah, I would put it this way.
Yes.
I hope,
okay,
Gunther, that you agree with my
yes.
interpretation of your question. And then we have a question from Bjorn Luley. Francesca, do you have contact with Ms. Katharina von Schnobein, the EU coordinator for combating anti-Semitism, who seems to have no idea whatsoever what you just told us about the realities and content of Israel's occupation regime? And so that was is a shorter question. And finally, a question from Kerstin, which is about the most up-to-date news of the Israeli military and settler gangs who murder Palestinians. How do you assess these murders? Are they systematic, and what is their objective? How long will the Israeli state be allowed to murder under the eyes of the world? Why are Palestinians completely unprotected, even though international law exists? So these are the 4 questions. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. They're all interesting questions, and I could be here speaking for hours, but I will try to be. So I will reply to Eckhart and Günther's questions together. In international law, there is not really something like the right to use violence. There is the right to use force. So, for example, at international level, states the use of force is justified only in response to the use to a threat or an unlawful use of force itself. For example, when you get aggressed, when there is an illegal, a serious and illegal act against your state that threatens peace and security, etc. And then at the individual level, so in that case, a state has a right to self-defense. And so when there is an imminent threat or a danger, something happening, like responding to a war or responding to an attack, there is the possibility to use the force legally. This is the first case. The second case is even stronger when it's authorized by the UN Security Council. These are the only 2 cases in state relations where, very simply put, use of force is authorized. At the individual level, and I think going to the question of Günther, what is the legitimate right to resist? The right to resist, there is no really huge literature and documentation and jurisprudence on that, and it's clearly why. Because the states tend to preserve themselves and struggle to really recognize the right of individuals or groups or communities to resist state power. No, nonetheless, there is a recognition of the right to resist in international law, and it's in additional protocol 1 to the Geneva Convention, but it's also considered a critical component of the right of self-determination, meaning the right of self-determination is the right to exist as a people and to determine themselves as a people, politically, economically, culturally, over a given territory. Every time there is a threat to this right to exist as a people, with an illegal occupation, with an act of war, the right of self-determination is in danger, then the people have the right to resist. So, but even resistance, even the legitimate use of force follows certain rules. So the use of force can never ever, so for example, the right to life has limitations. You can kill under international law. For example, you can kill an enemy in combat, but still you need to observe certain principles of necessity, distinction, and proportionality. So you cannot target civilians ever. Civilians should not be killed. And who's a civilian? Who's not someone who's not part of the military, someone who's not part of an armed group. And to be part of an armed group, you need to be recognizable. Now, I know that this is the sensitive issue because, and it goes to the question, I think that also, always Gunther was asking, how do you distinguish between a resistance and a terrorist? A terrorist is someone who commits an act of violence targeting civilians. There are at least 22 definitions of terrorism in the international arena, and the states have not agreed on what it is. But in general, targeting with violence civilians to reach an ideological or a political goal, this is terrorism. Israel makes a very huge use and uses a lot of nonchalance of putting in the terrorist cauldron everyone and everything. But in fact, what I documented and demonstrated in my report, that terrorists or hostiles are considered most activities that are void of any criminal offense under international law. So it should be determined on a case-by-case basis. But let me conclude with this. Israel is confusing the security of its own security, the security of Israel, with the security of its annexation plan in the occupied territory. Israel has no right under international law to establish colonies, and therefore to defend them. I'm sorry, the best way to protect the settlers is taking them out of the occupied territory, or if they want to stay as part of under Palestinian Authority, this should be assured once reparations have been made. No one should be evacuated with force. I'm against it as a human rights lawyer. But at the same time, Israel cannot treat any Palestinian as a terrorist and any Palestinian as an incarcerable threat, depriving them of the protections of international law, just because they resist to land confiscation and to their forced displacement. This is what's happening in the occupied territory. And going to, so I will also answer now Kirsten's question regarding what's going on. Yes, it's the violence committed by settlers and the army is fully documented. So I do see that it's widespread. And it seems to me that it's also systemic in the sense that there are no instances if you see the numbers of people killed or injured or arbitrarily arrested and detained per month, it's systemic. No month passes by without it happening. And again, we need to consider this against the framework of an illegal occupation that shouldn't be there in the first place. So the Palestinians are totally unprotected. Unless, I mean, and this is why they are organizing themselves to resist. I wish it was different. And because I'm on top of being a human rights lawyer, I'm a pacifist, 100%. And I don't want to see the revival of violence. But resistance is the only thing that seems to be left to the Palestinians, lacking any kind of response by the international community, which has an obligation to ensure protection as part also of the realization of the Palestinians' right of self-determination. And there's no response from the Israelis who grant impunity, almost total impunity. When I say almost, it's because there are probably those individual cases where get investigated, but very, very rarely, close to zero, gets prosecuted among the settlers and the soldiers. Now I've heard some words of condemnation by Israeli politicians of what, or Israeli, in the political arena of what was happening in Hawara or Tormsie recently. But I'm sorry, this is not, while this is extreme, settlers have been building over 56 years under everyone's watch. So the violent settlers are not different from the colonial enterprise that Israel has set up in the occupied Palestinian territory under the pretense of security. And the last point concerning whether I've encountered or met the European representative on anti-Semitism, we have exchanged messages on Twitter because we clearly have a very divergent approach to the IHRA, the definition of anti-Semitism. It was very interesting because I was challenged. I mean, I've challenged her on the fact that this definition has a huge stifling impact on civil society, on freedom of assembly, freedom of expression. And I wondered whether a human rights assessment had ever been conducted. Also because there are hundreds of Israelis and Jewish people against the IHRA around the world, including 350 Jewish scholars in relative disciplines who have proposed another definition, which says anti-Semitism is discriminating Jews because they're Jews, which seems so linear and simple. So one can be critical of one can say anti-Semitic things while criticizing Israel, but this is not the norm. It's not that criticizing Israel is per se anti-Semitic. And there was also some civil society that exposed the fact that in fact the European Union has not carried out a human rights assessment before enforcing, adopting the non-binding definition of IHRA, of anti-Semitism by IHRA. And I look forward, frankly, to further opportunities to engage, but it has not happened yet.
Thank you very much, Francesca. I think those are all the questions. So we can start.
I'm happy. I mean, I have some. I know that it's 1 hour, and short and punchy is always better than long and boring. But if anyone has other questions, again, I'm really happy to stay a bit longer, and also to be contacted over emails if you feel like.
I wanted to also mention briefly that we've been joined by Eberhard Hirschler, who is a member of BIP, of our organization, and he's the publisher who translated the book by Nurit Peled and Hanan that you mentioned about the Israeli school book. So also for our audience who would rather read the book in German rather than in English, the book is available. And thank you for mentioning it. It is a very important book.
No, very well done. Thank you. Because I'm encouraged. I think that it's translated in my language, in Italian as well. It's so important. And I really encourage you to continue to host, but also for others, this kind of people, of Israelis, whenever also you are interested in understanding better the question of arrest and detention of Palestinians, including children, which is a very disturbing topic. There are wonderful Israeli lawyers who continue to work no matter what on to counter the effects of this system. So happy to put you in contact with them in case the contact does not exist yet.
Yeah, thank you for this also, Francesca. And actually, many of the people who were the original founders of BIP started their work with the EAPPI, and by observing the arrest of children and the trials of children, felt that they have to take some action. And so that's a little bit also the history of our organization. So yeah, absolutely. And thank you very much for your offer to stay in contact with us.
Yeah.
Because we will take you up on this offer.
There's still one question.
Yeah.
From Christian.
Oh, yes. Okay. So maybe let's call this our last question for today by Christian Drape-Müller. Which effect do you hope will your report make possible?
Not you very much. It's a super important question, Christian. I think that there is not much a report per se can do, unless it's a good report that enlightens, that unveils something that was not necessarily clear or understood, either in terms of facts or in terms of legal analysis. In a way, I think that I am, if I can say so, lucky, because there are so many good organizations documenting human rights, the human rights situation on the ground in the occupied Palestinian territory. So in many ways, I build on their work. But at the same time, I'm also conscious that especially in the last 30 years, there has been such a disconnect between the reality on the ground and how this is narrated, how this is discussed. There is really cognitive dissonance between the facts and again, the public discourse, being it through media, being it through politicians. And so my hope is to really, the way where I see my work being situated is there, helping change the discourse, because it's again the deep-rooted, deep entrenched and tentacular illegality, which corrodes and corrupts not only the Palestinian society, but also the Israeli society, which delivers the occupation, which advances the annexation, which dehumanizes the other. It cannot get not dehumanized itself in return. And this is why I want to operate in that space that allows to change the public perception and the public discourse. But of course, this is not something that I can do by myself. I bring to the table new findings and a sort of contextual interpretation of the facts and the law. But then I need really all of you to help disseminate the findings, to call upon politicians and the media to do a honest job, both of them, but also to make sure that current, present, and future generations are educated to the truth, because the truth is really the most iconic absentee in the current reality. It doesn't apply only to Palestine. I think it's a larger phenomenon. But Cristiane, this is how I see myself in this context.
Thank you very much. So thank you very much, Francesca, for giving us your time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Have a good evening and continued activism for justice and for human rights in Palestine.
Yes, thank you very much. And maybe, who knows, maybe see you in Germany sometime soon. Thank you very much, Shir, for organizing and for having us. Bye-bye. Auf Wiedersehen.